Welcome to the 4th Annual Guild of Music Supervisors Conference.
I'm a journalist, and we're here to talk about Jóhann Jóhannsson. Let's introduce our panelists. We have the producer of Mandy, Josh Waller. Come on, Josh. Writer-director of Mandy, Panos Cosmatos. And Jóhann's agent, Kevin Korn. Very intimate gathering.
It is.
Thank you for coming.
Do you guys want to like all sit down here, like on the floor, like curl up with a blanket?
Can we turn the lights down? I feel like I'm being testifying before Congress or something.
Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? So this is a little interesting of a panel. Our subject is not here, unfortunately. Jóhann passed in February. Is that right?
February.
Very young, very tragically, and but he left us with this incredible score for Mandy, which is out now. So has anyone seen it yet? It's a little early, but you should get to your nearest theater.
Awesome.
And buckle up.
Trust us, it's amazing.
You'll love it.
It is amazing, and it's an amazing showcase for Jóhann's final score. So it's a neat excuse to be talking about him, but we're also going to talk about him in general. So I'm assuming most of you know something or two about Jóhann, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here, but he left a very small body of work in terms of film music, and in terms of film music that we're aware of in American mainstream movies, but he left an incredible mark on the history of cinema in just a very short period of time with just a few scores, because they were so distinctive. He was really into sonic experimentation, as you saw in that video. He did not write conventional scores. He did not use the orchestra conventionally, and obviously worked with some very distinctive directors and some distinctive, bold films, which showcased his music in interesting ways. And in that short period of time, he really made a splash and left a real legacy and probably a huge influence on film music. So that's what we're here to talk about. Kevin, I want to start with you, just because you've known him, I think, the longest of all of us. You signed Jóhann before he really had a major film title to his name. Is that right?
Well, he did a bunch of films in other parts of the world. I think he did only one film in America at that point. But I met him because his albums, he was playing with on KCRW, Morning Becomes Collective with Jason Bentley, and I heard some of Fordlandia and Elgaborn, and instantly I had to work with him. And his manager, Tim, who is also friends with Josh, reached out to us, and I started working with him 7 years ago, 7.5 years ago, and our first film together was actually with Josh directing. And
that was before Prisoners?
Yes, mm-hmm. Before Prisoners. Prisoners came probably about a year into working with him, and the rest was history.
How did you find him? I mean, what led you to...
Daniel Noah, my partner at Spectre Vision, Dan and I have been obsessed with Jóhann for years, like for at least a decade. And part of, our thing just as a company, but, also just as friends, is that we felt that there was... that the film scores kind of go through these changes every like 10 or 20 years, and that like the sound of cinema and soundtracks, not to take anything away from John Williams and all these, but like they almost sounded the same for a longer period of time. And
people get comfortable with a sound.
Yeah, and then we felt there was all these new voices, these neoclassical composers that nobody was really tapping into for film. They might be over in like Iceland and stuff and doing these weird little experimental things, but we were like, no, this could be something. So Dan reached out to Tim. Tim was a friend of ours, and we met Tim because I had just I was trying to piece together a movie that I was directing, and so I just sent an email to Hauschka's email address.
Just off of his website.
Hey, I'm a filmmaker in Los Angeles and blah, 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 blah. And Hauschka got back to me right away. So, and then we decided we were going to work on a film together. And when Hauschka came out to LA, we all connected with Tim and everything like that. And Dan spoke with Tim about like, there's this composer named Jóhann Jóhannsson, and you need to like know more about this guy and blah, 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 blah. And that's kind of how we got connected. And you know, my film that I did was definitely not Prisoners or Mandy or anything, and no one even knows about it. But that's beside the point.
But you discovered Jóhann.
Yes, that's basically why I wanted to call you all here today. Is to take responsibility for this. Yeah. No, and we just started talking with Jóhann, and he just wanted to sink his teeth into something, and it was a little teeny indie film that I just had a thorn in my side to get made. I just felt like it was a story that needed the light shined on it, and fortunately so did Jóhann. So we both did it for like nothing. We both kind of put in some of our own money to make it happen, and I mean we did it for like nothing.
Is that score out there for people to listen to?
Yeah, and it actually, you know, people when I would venture to say that like the music for that film has probably made a lot more money than the film did, and I'm totally fine with that.
Yeah,
you
it's
know?
a good legacy.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned Hauschka because Jóhann was born and raised in Iceland. He was part of several bands. He played guitar, and then he started writing music. He started doing these acoustic, electronic, hybrid things. But then he was in Berlin for the past good while, and it seemed like he was part of this like composer musician collective, and everybody's friends with each other, which is unusual, especially for film composers who are usually very solitary. What can
he was always supporting of other filmmakers and composers and artists. I think he did. You know, his studio out in Berlin hosted a lot of great composers, and he worked with a lot of ballets and documentaries, and he would nurture a lot of the young composers that also worked with him. And I think what kind of happened is that they started this Kitchen Motors group, which was kind of a collective of composers out in Berlin. And Jóhann, through his efforts, I think breaking into film and TV really gave a lot of those other composers help and opportunity for them to also break over. So he was always a great collaborator and a great mentor, I think, to a lot of artists. And he was always exploring. So he would work with tons of different types of musicians.
It seems like he loved the collaboration part of it, that he wasn't this like composer who gives you the music, and you know, it was very, I'm sure you can speak to that, Panos, but we'll get to that in a second. So just sort of chronologically, he was in these bands, and then he started creating these solo albums, and then sort of simultaneously was scoring films, and then Prisoners with Denis Villeneuve was kind of his welcome to the world, and then of course they had Sicario and Arrival, and just one incredible sort of groundbreaking score after the other, and just with that list right there, he's left such a mark.
He always liked to diversify, and he never wanted to do the same thing over and over again. I think that's what really attracted him to a project like Mandy, and he would always strive to find a uniqueness for each film. I think, and that's what he would say, is that, you know, each film had to bring its own characteristics, whether it was A Theory of Everything or a Sicario. And when you say the idea of collaborating, he loved filmmaking and the art behind it. He was a storyteller himself in the way he created. And I think that collaborating with the director and being able to speak the music and bring it out of them was something that he found a lot of passion in.
And I know he didn't prefer to come on at the end. He liked to kind of be there from the ground, like being broken, and even at the script phase, visiting the set, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
which is a luxury for a composer, but I think that lends itself to why his music is so well integrated into some of these films, is that he was part of the story from the early stages.
Yeah, I mean, he probably talk more to that, but I think that Jóhann, he liked to read, so he would always like to read the script, but he also liked the interaction with the director, to be able to figure out the sound along the way. I think that's kind of, these days with schedules and the way that they do films, you don't always have that luxury. And when you get to work with a great production company like SpectreVision, and of course a great director, I think that he got very excited to get to the mind of Panos and be able to figure out what his film needed versus what all the other films that he's done before needed.
So Panos, what led you to Johann's door?
He came to my door in a way because I hadn't thought of Jóhann for the movie. You know, I wanted, you know, a very experimental synthesizer score that also blended in, you know, things like textures from heavy metal and doom metal and death metal. And I only knew Jóhann at the time. I'd heard pieces of his music from his solo records that I thought were incredibly beautiful, but they didn't make, you know, it didn't align in a way where I thought I heard the song when I was, you know, thinking about composers and thought of him. But I thought that his film scores were amazing. So then it turned out that he knew Black Rainbow and was into it, and
Huge fan.
and wanted to work with me, which like took me totally by surprise. First of all, like I thought that he was way out of my league. You know, I thought you know, an Academy Award winning composer is not going to want to work on some small you know, art film from a guy who made like a strange tone poem, you know, for his first film. But it turns out he did. But I still wasn't convinced in a way, even though I really greatly admired him and loved the stuff that he did. For this film, I just thought that his stuff was very, very Spartan, and I wanted to go into deeper, kind of like richer textures that were, you know, really what I like to call juicy. But after talking to him for 15 minutes on the phone, I realized that there was this whole other side of him where he came from metal bands and was basically an Icelandic metalhead at his heart, and also shared my fetish, you know, for all these very bizarre sort of synth sounds and stuff like that, and really thought it was a great opportunity to sort of explore that stuff. And I think, you know, I said to him that I thought of the film kind of as a rock opera, and I think that basically sealed the deal. You know, he saw that this was a world that he could like express himself in a new way, and that excited me, that he was excited by it, because I like to work with people that like to experiment and try to break new ground and you know, are very, very open to experimentation.
A lot of people notice of Black Rainbow's use of music, and it helped kind of jumpstart the trend of sort of retro 80s synthesizer type scores for films. Did you feel like you learned something from that experience, or had a different approach to music or score on Mandy after that experience?
No, I didn't learn anything. All I did was I do what I did. You know, like I wanted the score to sound that way. It was a purely fetishistic exercise. That, you know, I thought that the stuff that Jeremy does with the Sonoya Caves and was just so sonically perfect, and it inspired me when I listened to it. And you know, it was the same with him. You know, it was an experimental process, and the only thing I learned from it was that I felt like it worked, and I wanted to go further into that direction. You know.
Were you listening to music as you wrote the script for Mandy?
Yeah, well, I don't like sit there and like have music blasting while I type. I tend to write in dead silence, but when I'm actually like in the process of putting it in screenplay format, but when I'm like assembling the idea, the concept and the idea, and making notes, and, you know, getting, you know, building an image library and stuff like that, I tend to build like a playlist of songs that drive like the creative process, and then eventually, by the time I come around to making the movie, I have it like honed. I'll take that, which can be like a crazy long playlist that's all over the fucking place. Just for me. But then when we get closer, I'll make like a 10-song version for that everybody can have. The actors can have it. I know that Andrea listened to stuff on that playlist like every day before she went in front of the camera on her headphones. And Jóhann wanted it, you know, just to sort of get a sense of where I was at.
What was on that playlist?
It was basically just Call Me Maybe 10 times in a row.
On a loop for
That would work for this film.
Yeah. I'm not being facetious, but it's actually the truth.
Okay.
No.
It works.
Now there was some stuff from Flash Gordon, the Queen soundtrack from Flash Gordon on there. Some like the execution of Flash and the love theme and stuff like that. that was something that me and Johann connected over, was our love of the sort of sonics and the textures on that record.
But also the bombast or the intensity, the operatic.
To a
nature
degree,
of it.
yeah, for sure.
So had you cut the film when you started working with Johann?
Well, Johann started creating stuff early and sending it to us.
As you were cutting it, or when you were still shooting?
I don't remember actually if
He sent us Children of the New Dawn first.
Right, yeah.
And I feel like some of the doom throbby kind of
Yes,
thing,
yes.
like really early.
Yeah, that's true.
That was before we started cutting.
Yeah.
Okay. So
But then when we were in the sort of, I did a rough cut with Brett, and then in my basement, and then we went back to Belgium to finish editing it and do basically lock the film for sound and color. And during that time period, Johann just started bombarding us with stuff, so much material that it was almost impossible to sift through. And then eventually, Johann asked for a music editor, and we brought in this guy Krang, who was able to sort of sift through and edit and help Johann and us sort of manage all the material and find what we needed in it.
was he writing stuff to scenes, or was he just sending you ideas, general ideas? Or
It was to scenes generally, and then we would.
But you had more than you needed, or more than you knew what you could do.
Sometimes for certain sequences there would be so much stuff, and even just in the stems, there'd be so many layers of just amazing shit.
So there's a 2-hour Mandy album out there somewhere.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, maybe longer. Because he would send different versions of some of the cues. He'd be like, "Here's this one with literally several versions of the same cue for the same scene." He was like, "Try this," and then it's pretty amazing.
But there was a lot of stuff. But warning: these are traps. If you open it, it'll spill all over you. But yeah, sometimes he would send like a thought, an audio thought in a sense of something, and then we would say, I need it to be more operatic or more dark or more more emotional, and then he'd iterate and iterate and iterate.
I don't think film composers are used to hearing "go bigger," "go darker," "go."
They're not.
I don't.
Probably not Johann.
Yeah. Maybe not.
The first thing he gives you, and you're like, "Jesus, this is big and dark."
Johann would always, when he would think of the projects, he would write out a lot of his ideas in emails, I would assume too. He would always think of ideas and try to communicate it with the director. Sometimes with, for this project was probably bands and cues that you guys both like. But when he actually got into writing it, he would obsess over it and go nonstop, working on so many different revisions of it that there are a lot of hard drives of data.
I'm assuming a lot of this is analog synth or retro synth material.
Well, he actually almost everything Johann did, he would create his own libraries for things, which most composers do these days.
Yeah.
And they would, as they're building their library, they're learning new techniques and new skills. So they would then save everything that he's done. So sometimes even if it wasn't used, he would have something that he, learned something from, was working from, and then he would tweak and tailor that even more. So he would actually build his own sound library for each individual project instead of starting with something he already had.
Like on this film, he went to this synthesizer museum in Italy to collect sounds that could then be used later.
What was his studio like? Was it like a mad scientist laboratory, or does he just have racks of all kinds of gear? I'm assuming you've.
Yeah,
inside.
Not really. It actually was much more tame than. When I visited the first time, it was for Theory of Everything, and so. A lot of what we were watching was, recordings of the orchestral sessions, but I think he really liked to go out and find sounds, or he had incredible musicians inside his studio that he would go and, go to Hildur and ask her to play a cello piece that he's working on, and then he'd take it upstairs and completely manipulate it into something else. So it was a very collaborative madhouse, like you say.
Yeah. Can you speak to where this interest in sonic invention, sonic experimentation came from? I know his dad was a computer programmer, and that probably seeped into his DNA in some way, but
A lot of ways.
Yeah, I think too that he studied literature and English and story, and he always used to say, "I'm a storyteller," whether he was in the composer's chair or if he was doing an album. And I think that I remember he said in an interview one time he always felt people were looking for new sounds, new ideas, and I think a lot of it came from the fact that he did start as an Icelandic metalhead and learned more about the classical stuff, I think probably later on in life.
So he wasn't like constricted by this like notion of what classical should be.
Yeah.
What you guys can all chime in here, but what do you think about him or this approach made him such a unique or good composer for film? Like why is this set of skills or that mentality good for film?
That's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of film composers are very. It's almost like they're following. What's that fucking book that tells you how to write a script?
Oh, Save the Cat or
No,
Screenplay.
Sid Field.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of composers. It feels like, especially in Hollywood, it's like it's almost like they're following Sid Field's guide to screenwriting, but for composing, And I think when you juxtapose a sound with an image, there's a million different ways that can feel, and I think that's why experimental musicians like him are so important, because you could actually create a whole new reality that nobody's ever expected just by the way you juxtapose the image with the sound unexpectedly,
It's true. I mean, yeah, he his approach to thinking about what type of films he wanted to do was also very interesting. We were talking before about Christopher Robin, which is a film he was going to do after Mandy.
Quite a left turn.
Quite a left turn, yeah. And I still remember him talking about the script, because at first even I wasn't sure if he was going to be interested, and he wrote a 4-page letter talking about these different ideas of a brass band mixed with the music box, mixed with this violin string sound, and all these different playful things that he was going to draw from on it. So I think that for him, there was a couple things that attracted to each different project that probably inspired him, whether it was Denis Villeneuve or for this project, I can tell you honestly that he was such a fan that he really wanted to work on this project, and I knew that they would get along just because they were working with you guys. But I think what made him so unique was the fact that he always looked at it like a storyteller, and he used the sounds to try to tell stories in new ways.
This is also, collaborative medium. We talked about that, but it's not just his approach to music or his experimentation. Humans have to get along and work well. Why do you think he was a good collaborator just from a personal standpoint? What made him a good collaborator?
Because he was an open, sensitive, creative person that would communicate with you. He wasn't an ego. One of the first things I do when I'm going to meet, might work with somebody is I just want to meet them and talk to them just so I can find out if they're a fucking douchebag or a psychic vampire or somebody that you don't want to spend more than 5 minutes around, So Jóhann was a real human being with like a huge creative heart, and you just know in 5 minutes that I want to spend time with this guy just being creative,
He was a gentle soul. He was such a sweet, nice guy who, he didn't talk a lot, but when he did have something to say, you knew it was really thought out. He was an incredible writer. The way he communicated via email, I think, he'd go all these nights with being just enamored into a project where I was waiting on a response from something, and then I get a 2-page email with the most brilliant answers to every question that I would have for him. And I think that was some of his best way of communicating too, was kind of that written expression. So I think for working with directors, he would always want to work with somebody that allowed him to work in that way, communicate in that way, and also just be inspired by that collaboration.
Why did he like being in Berlin? Was there a reason he stayed there? Was he tempted to come to LA or even London?
No, there's a great art scene going on in Berlin. A lot of great artists are moving there, both in the visual and music mediums. I think, he lived in Copenhagen when I first started working with him. But him and Dustin O'Halloran, one of his good friends, they all moved to Berlin together and started the studio.
Can you talk about the foundation?
Yeah. So the Jóhann Jóhannsson Foundation is launched by his family and friends and a lot of people that knew him in the business worlds. And we actually me and Jóhann talked about this idea a long time ago. And it's heartbreaking to think that the foundation is now dedicated to him in this honor. But Jóhann really inspired a lot of different people in many ways. And we would talk a lot about music education and how he had a great music education. I had a great music education, but we don't really teach a lot about composition or expressing yourself through music in schools. We teach kids how to paint in art history. We teach kids how to write before they become novelists, but we don't really teach kids how to write their own music while they're learning to play, the great scores and things that we're learning in school. So we wanted to create a foundation where we could connect, artists that inspire other composers, like Jóhann inspired other composers, to be able to support programs, workshops, scholarships, mentorships, not just here in the United States, but all around the world. So it's a foundation that's dedicated to the idea that Jóhann wanted everybody to express their own unique voice, and that there should be opportunities for kids to learn. And today we actually just updated our website that has all of our core missions on there of the things we want to do. So if you guys want to check it out, it's the www.thejohannjohanssonfoundation.org. And we hope that we'll be getting some of these workshops and things going probably by next year.
That's great.
Awesome.
This is a big picture question, but what do you guys feel like? Obviously, Jóhann left behind these really iconic film scores and contributed to these particular films. What do you feel like the legacy is? Do you feel like you see or hear an influence in film music that kind of came in his wake, or a different approach to scoring films? Do you think people are more open to scores that don't sound like everything else, or scores that are much less subtle and tame and submissive in the way that Mandy is, in a very good way?
It's almost an impossible question to answer, I think, but it's a good one.
However, what I can say is that after Prisoners and Sicario, it seemed like every single movie trailer, it was all over the place. People licensing those scores, or trying to copycat it. And it was just like, oh, there's their version of Sicario, or their. So I think he had an immediate impact.
You know what it was? That reminds me. It was like the moment that made me. When Jóhann came up, and before I even talked to him, I just remembered that there's that cue in Sicario where this SWAT team is descending down into this valley as the sun sets, and it's just, I think it's one of the greatest music cues in cinema history. It's like just the sky and these silhouetted men sort of descending into more shadow and merging with the shadow, and Villeneuve is just, it leaves it uncut for I think a minute or something with this, and Johann's music, I think, is one of the greatest music cues in cinema history because of Jóhann.
I think he left an impact not only to a lot of up and coming composers, but as well to filmmakers that want to try different ideas, different approaches. And the great thing about the film music world is there are many opportunities to have different types of scores. And, I think it also inspired people that want to kind of follow not more his path of the types of films that he did. They feel more comfortable knowing that they can be a little bit more avant-garde or go out. You look back at Tom Newman and John Carpenter and a lot of great avant-garde composers who are now mainstream legacy composers. And I think Jóhann joins that list of people who inspired another generation to explore new sounds.
Yeah, in some ways we don't know what the impact is right away, because it could be people just starting to learn how to write music or play music that are being influenced by this.
Oh, and they see Mandy too. They're probably going to need to watch this film 10, 20 times.
I just recently discovered, and maybe this speaks to my ignorance to a certain degree about how film scores work in the modern age. But I started realizing, I was watching some newer films and hearing the Tron Legacy soundtrack in these other movies, but like exactly the Tron Legacy soundtrack. And I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, why the fuck is this happening? Am I going crazy? And then I started digging into it, and it just turns out that they'll use what do you call it, temp tracks from Tron Legacy, and then just literally get this composer whose name I won't say to replicate that. And it's the difference between somebody like him and somebody like him. I mean, the two extreme ends of the spectrum, because there's many different levels of creativity, but like somebody that's just basically replicating temp track, and then somebody like Jóhann is on the far end of the spectrum, where he's actually digging deep into his soul and into his environment, and like bringing treasures up from the deep, and then that's the real deal,
Which is why he didn't like to use temp tracks.
We actually got it into. He would actually ask for it in his deals not to have temp track. I don't think we ever got those in there. But
no, we didn't have. There were no temp tracks.
Yeah, there was no temp tracks in this. In Sicario, I remember the first cut he got was a 3-hour, completely silent cut, or just the dialogue in it. And yeah.
See, that is so dependent on the director, the producer, the studio, being willing to not say, make it sound like Tron Legacy, or even make it sound like Sicario, because the wrong lesson to learn is copy his sound. It's so cool. It worked so well in Sicario or Arrival or Mandy or whatever.
Well, the reason that stood out to me is because it was not just like evoking it or being like, this sounds cool, something that sounds like that. It was literally just like, it was literally copying it.
But it's a risk averse business.
Yeah.
And so what usually that leads to is music ends up in a trend, or just almost exactly replicating the things that came before. I think if Johann's legacy, the best would be letting someone who wants to experiment and wants to give the film a really distinct musical personality that doesn't sound like the last 10 films that just came out, letting them do their thing. And it's great that he got to work with people that let him do that.
One of my favorite calls with him one time, he met a director, I won't say who, but they said, many people would think of this composer for the score, this composer for the score, but I look at you and I go, I have no clue what you would do. And he knew, and unfortunately it was a project he wasn't able to do because he was gone, but he knew that he was excited about working with that director for that one comment.
Well, you all need to see Mandy and listen to the score, and you'll hear it very prominently if you see the film, which is a really nice send-off, I think, to give it such a showcase. And it feels a little airless in here, and everyone's hungry, so I think we might as well wrap it up. Thanks for coming, and thank you guys for being on the panel.
Thanks, man.